Das ist unmöglich, that's what German engineers whispered, as they watched the Allies build a port where no port existed. June 7, 1944. Normandy, France. A pale mist hangs low over the shattered coastline. The thunder of naval guns that once shook the earth has faded, replaced by the groan of waves dragging spent shell casings back into the surf. Captain Wilhelm Hartmann, a German combat engineer with the 352nd Infantry Division, trudges across a cratered bluff near Arromanches. His field glasses are caked with sand. Below him, on the gray horizon, he spots what looks like wreckage-shard landing craft, floating debris, and strangely, long lines of ships forming a distant wall. He lowers his binoculars, frowning. They've brought in a fleet, he mutters to his sergeant. But where are they unloading? There are no ports here. Every French harbor capable of docking Allied ships from Cherbourg to Le Havre remains under German control. Berlin's analysts had assured commanders that without a major port, the invasion would starve. Supplies, fuel, tanks, everything the Allies needed to survive on French soil had to come ashore through these beaches. Hartmann raises his binoculars again. What he sees this time makes no sense. Massive steel structures are being towed through the surf by tugboats. They look like pieces of a bridge, huge rectangular boxes, half submerged, linked by floating roadways. Behind them, cranes and bulldozers rumble onto the beach, men shouting over the crash of waves. They're building something, the sergeant whispers. Hartmann says nothing. In his mind, one thought repeats like a drumbeat. Das ist unmöglich. This is impossible. As the tide rises, the wreckage becomes a pattern, a lattice of pontoons and caissons stretching farther out to sea. The Allies are not waiting for a port. They are building one. The Germans watch in stunned silence as the impossible begins to take shape. 200 miles away, across the English Channel, the operations architects, British engineers, and American Seabees had spent months working in absolute secrecy. They called it Operation Mulberry. The plan was as bold as it was absurd. Tow an entire artificial harbor, massive concrete breakwaters, floating roadways, and steel piers across one of the roughest stretches of sea in Europe, assemble it under enemy fire, and make it operational within days. Back in London, the German Abwehr had dismissed rumors of such a project as Allied propaganda. Their naval engineers scoffed at the idea. You can't build a port on the sea, one officer said. Not in the Channel. The waves would tear it apart in hours. But the Allies had already done the math. The Mulberry design was a marvel of improvisation and logistics. Phoenix caissons, giant hollow concrete blocks, some weighing over 6,000 tons, to form breakwaters. Whale roadways, floating steel bridges that rose and fell with the tide. Spud piers, platforms supported by adjustable legs, allowing ships to unload cargo directly onto trucks waiting on the beach. Every piece was prefabricated in Britain. Over 600,000 tons of steel and concrete then quietly floated across the Channel after D-Day. At Arromanches, codenamed Gold Beach, and at St. Laurent, Omaha Beach, these parts were assembled by engineers working in waist-deep water, under constant Luftwaffe air raids. Bulldozers dragged sections into alignment while Royal Navy tugs strained against the current. Men labored without rest for 72 hours, sometimes welding by the light of burning wrecks offshore. By June 14th, a week after the landings, Mulberry, a harbor at Arromanches, was fully operational. Allied ships lined up in the mist, unloading tanks, trucks, fuel, and ammunition. From his observation post, Captain Hartmann stared through his binoculars again. What he saw now defied reason. Cargo ships that had once needed deep-water docks were offloading directly onto the French coast. The bridge stretched for miles, a living artery pumping men and machines into Normandy. "Sir," his sergeant said quietly, "it's a harbor, made of pieces." Hartmann lowered his binoculars slowly. "Then," he said, "we have already lost France." June 15, 1944. Arromanches, Les Bains. The weather turns violent. Sheets of rain hammer the coastline, and waves slam against the new harbor. German artillery from inland batteries hurl shells toward the beach, exploding harmlessly shore. But the Allied engineers, mud-caked, soaked, and sleepless, keep working through the storm. On the cliffs beyond Bayeux, Captain Hartmann stands with a field radio pressed to his ear, straining to hear Berlin's voice through the static. Command demands confirmation. "Can you verify the enemy has established a functioning port?" Hartmann watches as an American Liberty ship unloads its cargo, rows of Sherman tanks rolling off a floating pier, engines growling like beasts. Behind them, trucks stacked with crates marked fuel, rations, and ammunition stream inland toward Keene. He answers slowly, "Yes, they've built a harbor, from the sea itself." The officer on the other end hesitates. "That's not possible." Hartmann almost laughs. Then perhaps the impossible has joined the Allies. At Allied headquarters, General Bernard Montgomery receives word that the Mulberry system is outperforming even the most optimistic projections. Within its first 10 days, over 100,000 tons of supplies have been landed. The harbor functions like a living machine. Waves crash, steel groans, but cargo keeps flowing. Meanwhile, German analysts in Paris and Berlin scramble to explain what they're witnessing. Aerial reconnaissance photographs reveal long lines of ships unloading side by side, with bridges stretching from sea to shore. One intelligence officer writes in disbelief, "They have created a port where no port exists. This is not war, it is engineering beyond comprehension." The Kriegsmarine engineers who once boasted of their coastal defenses fall silent. They had relied on geography to defend France, believing that without deep-water ports, any invasion would collapse under its own logistics. But the Allies have rewritten the laws of war. The Atlantic Wall, built with concrete, steel, and millions of man-hours, has been rendered obsolete by innovation. That night, as Allied searchlights sweep across the sea and the harbor hums with the sounds of cranes and engines, Hartmann watches from afar. He realizes that the war is no longer being won by tanks or guns, but by men who can build faster than destruction can keep up. He writes in his journal, "They did not conquer France by force of arms, they built their way into it." June 19, 1944. The sky above Normandy burns red with warning. The channel, calm for days, erupts into chaos. Winds reach over 65 miles per hour, waves rise higher than houses, and rain lashes across the French coast with unrelenting fury. The Mulberry Harbors, still young and fragile, groan under the assault of nature itself. At Arromanches, American and British engineers fight to keep the harbor alive. Chains snap like gunfire, pontoons wrench free from their anchors, and cranes collapse into the sea. The storm tears apart landing craft and scatters floating bridges into twisted wreckage. For 3 days and nights, the channel howls. The Mulberry Harbor at Omaha Beach is devastated, its caissons shattered, its piers ripped from their moorings. The Americans, heartbroken but pragmatic, abandon it. But at Arromanches, the British refuse to give up. Major Alan Beckett, one of the engineers who designed the floating whale bridges, leads a team into the surf, waist-deep in freezing water. "Hold the line," he shouts through the storm. With torchlight flickering through rain, they re-anchor pontoons, lash cables, and weld under lightning strikes. By June 23, when the winds finally die, the British harbor Mulberry Beach still stands. Damaged, yes, but operational. The Allies cheer as supply ships once again ambush the battered. News of the survival spreads quickly. Allied High Command realizes the harbor has withstood the worst the channel could throw at it. The Germans, on the other hand, receive the report in disbelief. In Berlin, Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, studies aerial photos of Arromanches. He circles the harbor with a trembling pen. "We underestimated them," he admits quietly to his aide. "They have turned the sea itself into a factory floor." By July, the Mulberry Harbor is unloading more than 7,000 tons of supplies per day, trucks, fuel, tanks, ammunition, and rations pouring endlessly into Normandy. The Allied beachhead, once vulnerable, is now unstoppable. Captain Hartmann, now retreating with what remains of his engineering unit, looks back toward the coast. The sound of engines and cranes carries on the wind like a heartbeat. He whispers, "They built a bridge across the sea, and we never saw it coming." August 1944. The dust of summer drifts across Normandy's fields. What began as a desperate gamble has now become a miracle of logistics. The Mulberry Harbor at Arromanches hums day and night. Ships queue for miles offshore, each unloading crates, fuel drums, and victuals. Bulldozers roar across the beach while soldiers guide convoys inland toward the front. Every plank, cable, and caisson creaks with the weight of victory. In less than 3 months, over 2.5 million men, 500,000 victuals, and 4 million tons of supplies have passed across this floating port. What once seemed like a temporary structure has become the backbone of liberation. General Dwight D. Eisenhower later called it the key to victory in Europe. Without Mulberry, the Allied advance could have starved before reaching Paris. With it, fuel lines, ammunition, and reinforcements flowed like blood through arteries of steel. Meanwhile, in Berlin, a somber meeting unfolds inside the Reich Chancellery. Maps of France are spread across the table, littered with red arrows pushing eastward. An engineer from the organization taught one of the men who once designed the Atlantic Wall points to Arromanches and speaks in a low voice. They defeated concrete with imagination. Owen responds. The room falls silent except for the ticking of a clock. Even Hitler, pacing behind the desk, cannot comprehend how a nation built an entire harbor under fire and used it to flood Europe with men and machines. By late August, Paris is liberated. The Allied tide, powered by the floating docks at Arromanches, rolls east toward the Seine and beyond. The harbor continues its relentless rhythm, ships docking, cranes lifting, trucks departing. From above, reconnaissance pilots describe it as a mechanical sit on water. And yet, amid the triumph, there's something deeply human about it. The men who built Mulberry were not frontline soldiers or generals, they were engineers, welders, divers, and dockworkers. Ordinary men who turned raw ingenuity into a weapon more decisive than any bomb. Months later, when the war finally ends, the Mulberry Harbor is quietly dismantled. Sections of it remain buried beneath the tides of Arromanches, rusting silently under a wave. Fishermen still see the shapes at low tide, ghostly remnants of a time when victory was built by hand. Captain Wilhelm Hartmann survives the war. In 1946, now a civilian, he visits Normandy under the gray French sky. He stands by the cliffs once more, overlooking the same stretch of sea. The tide rolls in, gentle and calm, but beneath the waves lie the bones of the structure that changed the course of history. He removes his cap and whispers to no one in particular. They built a harbor where there was none, and with it, they built the end of our world. The wind carries his words out to sea toward the ghostly ruins of steel and concrete that once defied the impossible.